Alright, so you're inside the editor. We should probably begin by creating something soon. But first, let's take a tiny look on the editor here. So first you have the cursor, and you can also move your player avatar, which is represented by the white arrow here. You can move it by holding the right mouse button or just clicking around. Zoom in, use A or Z, or you can use the mouse wheel to zoom in or zoom out. I recommend to zoom in a little bit at first, so it's at a reasonable area. And on the bottom left, you have the coordinates. These are exactly proportional to the cursor that you have here. So the angle, the X and Y are represented here. And here the map limits are down here. Currently, we haven't really done much, so it's still obeying the stock limitations that pretty much developers had to work with in 1995, 1996, or something like that. So as you go along, these map limits will extend tremendously. If you surpass these, that is. But first, let's start by creating a simple sector. All things in the build engine are consisting of sectors, walls, and sprites. So sectors are basically the basic building blocks that represent the shape of where the player is. This is like a basic room. I can create or remove points, make it more complicated and less complicated. So this is basically the basic shape of a room that you just created. But let's start from scratch. I will guide you. So press the spacebar, press it again until you have created the room. And if you mess up, like let's say you create something like here by accident, you can use the backspace button to rewind like that. And you always have to do a full loop. It doesn't matter if you do hundreds of points, but it has to end on the same loop. Otherwise, the engine is not going to consider it a full loop. And it's going to, in worst case, it's going to look glitchy. You can do stuff like this, and it will still work, but it doesn't look good. So I won't recommend doing it. It will not crash. All right, here we have our first room. I highly recommend pressing Ctrl F10 as a first time thing. It will save this configuration in future runs, but this is extremely helpful as it gives you a 3D perspective. And this is the important bit why we pick the resolution, so that the 2D and 3D resolutions match. Plus, the software mode is being used here as well, so it matches what you see later on in 3D mode. You can switch in between 2D and 3D mode. As long as the player is in valid 3D space, you can easily tell if the player is in valid 3D space if you have the viewport here, as long as you have it enabled. I press numpad enter, and this puts me in 3D mode. And over here, you can use the arrow keys to move around. That's the classic method. This also works in 2D mode. This is just like controlling an old FPS game, basically. But also, since we're in 2019, we also use brand new 90s technology called mouse and graphical user interfaces, well, sort of. So if you hold the mouse button, left mouse button, you lock on and you can do the same movement as you do with the mouse. I highly recommend studying the movement with the mouse because it makes mapping so much easier. So I'm holding the mouse at the moment, and if I hold the right mouse button, with the left mouse button, I can move around like this and change my height along with my position. So the combination of these two are very, very handy to learn. If you only hold the right mouse button, you can freely look around as if it was a 3D thing. And you can use mouse 5 to reset this so that you look straight again. It's a new hotkey added for Fury specifically. Alright, so you can see the dynamic nature. If I pick the point from here and drag it around, you can see in the viewport on the top right that it actually automatically changes shape. And if you want to add or remove points, you just press insert to insert a new point and delete to remove a point. Doesn't want to remove it. Oh, sorry, shift delete to remove a point. This is a new feature that was actually added pretty recently. Extremely helpful because it allows you to delete points. And at this point, one important key is Ctrl Z to undo. If you press Ctrl Shift Z, you can redo the action you just undid. Alright, let's insert a few wall points here. You can do basic geometry like this. Let's say we want to create a hallway. You can do it if you really want to, this way. And now we have a hallway here. Tiny hallway that we can go in. This is one way to shape the sectors. So let's say we want to create something basic like, let's say, basic shapes here. And this is already enough to do a lot of the basic shapes. In 3D mode, you can use page up, page down on the ceiling or on the floor to raise it up or down. I recommend raising it a little bit from the default setting. You can use the handy markings on the textures to see which is good and which is not. To change your Z mode, press caps lock. This will change the behavior. Are you locked sector? So right now I'm using the free mode, but if I press enough, it will simulate gravity. So right now I'm simulating gravity. If I press A, I will jump. If I press Z, I will crouch. These are not really one-to-one what you get in game, but they give you a rough idea on the player scale. So right now we have a room that's about moderately tall for a typical interior. But let's change it a little bit, make it a little bit more interesting. So one of the more interesting features in 3D mode is of course changing the textures. So press V on your keyboard, V for Victor. Press it again. The first view always shows you the most used tiles in your current maps, but since this is a new map, we have nothing. When we press V again, it will show you the whole index of the textures that you have in the game. And you can use the arrow keys to move around, page up, page down as well. But then, since there's so many textures, you have to move. You can see on the bottom left, the tile counter keeps increasing. There's actually a hotkey you can use that you can just press E for echo. And this will drop you right at where the actual map tile starts. Extremely useful. So let's pick a wall texture. Since we're dealing with interior, let's say we can find anything cool for interior. We'll just use this one for now. And you see it is way oversized for what you want. Let's use numpad. You can use numpad 2, 4, 8, 6. Why those keys? If you have an old keyboard, you might see that they actually have the arrows still on them, but the newer keyboards might not even have that. This is also why you really need a numpad keyboard to work with Mapster. Let's press numpad 2. This will shrink the texture. You can see the repeats on the bottom left that they change as I do this. And you can shrink, extend. But you can see already that we are not really matching the height, so let's do it a little bit higher, and now you can see that the black part meshes nicely with the floor. For Fury, we actually have a hotkey that is really useful. Once you have found the height, you just press Alt W, which is W for whiskey. So this will fix wall repeats. And right now you got a beautiful wall texture on the wall. You can copy paste this. You press tab, it puts it on the clipboard, and then you can press enter to paste it along the walls. And if you want, you can paste this on the walls, all the walls. But now if we pick a different texture, let's say we pick the brick walls, you can already see that the scale is much better than what it would have been before had we just done without the scaling. So this is an easy way to work with. So now you notice that the bricks aren't really aligned over here, but we can actually fix it by pressing period key, and this will do the auto line function that's built into the editor. Alright, and let's do something for the floor. We press E again. And what is different with the floor is that you actually cannot stretch or shrink the textures. There's only one way to work with the floor textures, and you can move them around, or you can expand and shrink. There's two different modes for the floor texture. And let's see if we can find anything cool for the floors. No, let's see. So you can see the texture set is pretty extensive, and if you get lost and you want to start over again, you can just press E and it puts you right back to the start. Let's go with this texture here, this wooden texture. And you can see it's a little bit big by default. This is because back then in the 90s, this was considered like appropriate pixel density for a lot of areas. So right now we press E, echo, and it actually shrinks the texture. There's only two different settings for the texture when it comes to the size. You can use numpad 4, 6, 8, or 2 to move it around. I would recommend that you hold shift. This will enable the texture panning, and if you click the mouse button, it will actually pan the texture around, so you can really smoothly and easily pan the texture around. Makes it a lot easier. This same trick works on the wall textures. And you can also stretch and shrink the textures if you press Control and then press the mouse button. Much easier than the numpad. And you can also, well, change the height of these textures by holding Alt and then up and down on the mouse. You have to point at the ceiling or floor to do this. Let's undo a little bit. And then you can slope by holding Control. We'll get to this later. But there's a lot of different functions that you can use the mouse with. Let's look for a ceiling that we can use. How about this? For many ceiling textures, you can also use the smaller size for the repeat, because a lot of times you might have, like, let's say, a taller area and the ceiling doesn't look as bad at this point as it would have with the floor. So let's start doing a little bit. Okay, I just decided I want to do a hallway here, so I'm going to make this a little bit longer. I want to add a wall point here, and I want to make it a hallway, and I want to make it a tiny bit smaller. So it's really easy to quickly change your mind when working with this engine. And here, and okay, at this point I should probably adjust shading a little bit. So you can use the numpad minus or the numpad plus to adjust shading. I prefer using the mouse wheel, which makes it much easier to adjust the shading. So let's adjust the shading a little bit. Let's take 10. We put this one to 10 as well. And it's very, very important that you do basics of shading. Even just shading these two walls differently from each other already makes the room look way more 3D than it was before. So you can just compare, let's say we shade this one to -10 and we shade this one to -10. You can already see that there's much bigger sense of 3D in the room that would be otherwise without the shading applied to the walls. Engines like Doom do this automatically, but with Build Engine you have to do it manually because you have so much more control over the shading. Alright, and let's start shading the floor a little bit. Let's make it a little bit darker. But now you can see that it's also affecting this corridor hallway that we wanted to do. At this point, we need to start working with more sectors. So what we have created here is still this sector 0 as far as the game is concerned. And so is the ceiling. So it doesn't matter which one we shade, it will shade both of the sectors. So let's get back to the 2D mode. And you can split sectors by drawing a line between the wall points. So let's say I want to do a sector here. Now they have been split. So this sector is different from this one. And if I want, I can now start shading this one darker. And I can also change the height. And this makes it really nice because now you can start doing like complex geometry that you normally wouldn't be able to do. All right, let's say we want to create a tiny different area here. Let's say we want to create an opening. We create sectors inside the sector, but it's first going to do walls here. But that's not really what we want. So how to make it a child sector? Traditionally, in old build engine sense, you usually drew a second set of walls on top of the sector, and this was enough to make a new sector. But what I recommend is that you point at one of the walls and press Alt S for Sierra, and that is an easy way to make a new sector. So now you have a new sector inside this sector, and you can resize these as you see fit. Now we can shade this one a little bit darker, make this one sure that it's shade 0, and we can pick a texture that's something like outdoors. But you can see it looks a little bit dumb like this. To make it proper, you have to press P for Papa, and that makes it parallax. And now you can see that the texture is still just a flat texture over here internally as far as the game's concerned. But the rendering is done differently and gives you the illusion that there is actually another bigger layer behind there, even though there's nothing. And this is how you can create a lot of visual tricks that play with your mind and make things seem more 3D than they actually are. So right now, let's shade this one a lot brighter. We'll take these and these, and as you can see, with a little bit of work, we already have created something that looks a lot like a proper area. With shading and all. Very important thing to take into account, you always create sectors from inside to the, from outside to inside. So if I try to create a sector, let's say I decide I want to make this one a little bit smaller, but then I decide, alright, but I want to create something different here that goes on the outside. This is not gonna work. This will not work. If you try to do Alt S and you try to go around, you will see that you will start getting graphical glitches and all kinds of things disappearing. This is because the engine doesn't support working like this, because right now you have messed with the sector hierarchy. The best way is to undo this, and if you want to create a different height ceiling, let's say we want to create a rim around this area, you should create a surrounding sector that's shaped like a U shape. And now you can see that we can already start doing stuff like, let's say we want to create a tiny bit of gradient here. But we still need to connect this bit somehow. We can do this. And now we have a gradient there. But the problem is that we should still join these somehow. And that's where you got the J key, J, or whatever it was, John. Let's pretend that's forgot. So J and the sector have been joined. So right now, if I move this around, you won't get the graphical glitches anymore, because this is a proper way of doing it. This is very tricky, very, very tricky for the first time to grasp how the sector hierarchy works. But once you get the grasp of it, you'll avoid so many headaches that you might encounter otherwise. So right now we can create a nice smooth gradient by just doing something like this. And if you want, you can also create a rim here now that we have a different sector there. Doesn't look very nice, but let's try something else. try something like this, and now we use the E to shrink it. This looks better. There we go. I could either there. Let's try that one for now. And now you can of course resize and move these around as much as you want. You can also take the ceiling texture, apply it to walls as well. Reducing the shading a tiny bit and doing the wall corrections gives you the nice illusion of 3D. And you have an object that comes from the sky. Let's do full shading here. And it already looks something you could see on a map. Despite looking a bit garish. To delete a sector, point at it, press Ctrl Delete, and it will remove it. You will have to remove the wall points manually because they always stay there. But let's say we want to delete this window instead. J, that is not going to work. J, not going to work. So you have to do joining one at a time, and it removes the sector. You can also use Ctrl Delete to remove a sector, but the problem is that it might leave a sector inside as an orphan sector. You can do this, and then you're left with a sector that's in the way. To best get rid of these kind of sectors, I recommend that you just use the Alt-S to make it a sector, and then use the join tool, and this is the most clean way possible to get rid of these kind of sectors. Alright, that is the basic of working with sectors, and I will just show you a map. Let's say we take the map from this start of Haskell's House of Horrors. Just crashed. Let's try again. There we go. So we take this map, let's make it a little bit brighter so we can see what we're doing. And you can see the same principles being applied here. So this box here is a sector that has been raised. This difference in the shading, again, different sectors. I'll just lower these so you can kind of see what's happening here. There's of course a lot of different stuff involved here as well, but you can see that things need to be split into sectors if you want any kind of difference. So for example here, you can see the difference was done because there has to be some kind of difference here with the ceiling here and how it meets the ground, but then you also want the light to leak a little bit, so you really need different bits to be separated into different sectors. Otherwise it's not going to work. And then here you can see the walls as well. Here's one wall point. To create the illusion of shading, you just mess around with what you have. And for example, here you have to consider, is it worth doing a separate sector just to do a shade or not? The amount of sectors are limited. So for example, the preview, Haskell House of Horrors, you already are running out of walls. This is the absolute maximum amount of walls that the engine supports, and the 4096 sectors, we're still doing fine on that front, but the wall count is your enemy when it comes to sectors. Now let's just show something a little bit more even complicated. So you can see here, just gonna remove all the sprites to make it a little bit easier to see. But over here you can see that the path is a separate sector. The sides are a separate sector. This is a separate sector. And anything you want to do, any of these slope bits, any floor, any ceiling, any bit of ceiling or floor where you see that the texture is different, sloping is different, or the shading is different, or the palette is different, that is a unique sector. Technically, you can even paint stuff with sectors. Like over here, you can kind of do like different kind of rock formation, but it's not really recommended and can be resource intensive if you make it too extensive. Here's a box that is also a sector. It's just ground that has been raised from the ground and textured to be a box. A more extreme example of sector work is having a car. So for example, here we have a car that's using sloping on the windshield, on the side, bonnet, on the back, and it's a combination with sprites that we can get into later on, which are just flat 2D images that help to enhance the illusion of boxy objects, that they are actually more than meets the eye. But play around with the sector work, try modifying the maps we have shipped, and you'll be surprised what you can do.